It was December of 1941. The sun had not yet fully risen over Pearl Harbor when the sky filled with Japanese planes. Within hours, most of the Pacific Fleet lay on the ocean floor, engulfed in flames and black smoke. More than 2,000 Americans lost their lives that Sunday morning. And as the ash still fell over Hawaii, something changed forever in the American consciousness. For the first time since the Civil War, the United States was no longer inviolable. The ocean was no longer an absolute protection. And if Pearl Harbor could be attacked, then every city, every factory, every port was vulnerable. In the weeks following the attack, panic spread across the West Coast like wildfire. Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, all these cities stared at the Pacific horizon with a fear few Americans had experienced in generations. These weren't abstract fears of a distant war in Europe or Asia. They were the concrete fear of seeing planes looming through the clouds, of hearing sirens tearing through the night, of seeing their homes, their workplaces, turned into smoking craters. And there were very concrete reasons for this fear. The American West Coast had become, almost overnight, the heart of Allied arms production. Factories that once produced automobiles now manufactured tanks. Hangars that built commercial aircraft now produced bombers. Shipyards that built cargo ships now launched warships and aircraft carriers. Every week, tens of thousands of tons of military equipment left these facilities, and each one was a target clearly visible from the sky. Before we continue with this incredible story, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below what time you watched this video. This will greatly help the channel grow. Boeing in Seattle had one of the largest aircraft production facilities in the world. Plant number 2 covered more than 20 acres, a gigantic complex where B-17 bombers were assembled, those flying fortresses that would become iconic in European skies. From above, the factory was impossible to miss, a perfect rectangle of white roofs, with large open courtyards where half-assembled aircraft were displayed like toys on a shelf. Any Japanese bomber landing on the Washington coast would have an easier target than practice targets. Lockheed in Burbank, California, had the same problem. Its main plant produced the P-38 Lightning fighters, revolutionary aircraft with their 2 distinct fuselages and impressive speed. The factory was located deep in the San Fernando Valley, surrounded by mountains that would serve as perfect guides for any enemy pilot. It was like placing a giant arrow pointing to your own heart, and Douglas Aircraft, also in California, built the C-47 transports and bombers that would sustain the entire Allied war effort. Its facilities spread across Santa Monica, visible not only from the air but practically from the beach. A Japanese submarine could surface and bomb the factory without even needing to come very close to shore. The U.S. Army knew it had a problem, one that couldn't be solved simply by increasing air defenses or deploying more patrol fighters. Even if they managed to shoot down 90% of the attackers, the 10% that got through would cause catastrophic damage. A single bomb in the right place could destroy months of production. It could kill hundreds of skilled workers who had spent years training. It could, in the worst-case scenario, completely change the course of the war. But moving these factories was impossible. You couldn't simply dismantle a production line covering 20 hectares and rebuild it elsewhere. The cost would be astronomical. The time required would be measured in years, not months. And where would you move them? Inland? This would create massive problems with logistics, material transportation, and where the workers would live. No, the factories had to stay where they were. Then someone in some tense meeting in Washington had an idea that seemed at first glance completely crazy. If we can't move the factories, why don't we make them disappear? Not literally, of course. But what if we could make it so that, from the perspective of a pilot flying at 10,000 or 14,000 feet, those factories simply didn't exist? What if we could transform 20 acres of industrial plant into something that looked like a quiet residential neighborhood, or an open field, or simply nothing interesting? The idea wasn't entirely unprecedented. The British were already experimenting with camouflage on a large scale. During World War I, artists like Norman Wilkinson had developed dazzle paint for ships, those bizarre striped patterns that didn't attempt to hide the ship, but rather to confuse the observer about its speed and direction. And in the current war, the British were building fake factories, wood and canvas structures that resembled industrial facilities from above, in the hope that German bombers would waste their bombs on them. But this was different. This was the opposite. It wasn't about creating something fake to attract attacks. It was about making something very real disappear completely. And to do that, the US Army needed people with very specific skills. It needed people who understood illusion, perspective, how to make the impossible seem real. It needed theater people. It needed set designers. And so began one of the strangest and most secret projects of World War II. The Army began recruiting set designers, production designers, artists, people who had spent their careers creating imaginary worlds on stage. People who knew how to make a dining room look like a medieval castle, or a Hollywood studio look like the surface of Mars. People who understood that reality is largely a matter of perspective. One of the first to be recruited was John Stuart Detley, a set designer who had worked on numerous Broadway and Hollywood productions. Detley was known for his obsessive attention to detail and his ability to create environments that felt completely authentic even under the closest scrutiny. When the Army approached him in early 1942, he was working on a film. They told him their country needed his skills for something they couldn't discuss in detail, but which was of crucial national importance. Detley didn't hesitate. Soon he was leading a bizarre team. There were set painters who could recreate any texture, any material. There were theatrical carpenters who could build structures that looked solid but were light enough for a few people to move. There were lighting experts who understood how light and shadow created depth and dimension. And there were architects, real engineers, who had to ensure that these illusions not only looked convincing, but also didn't interfere with the real operations of the factories they were camouflaging. The first major project was the Boeing plant in Seattle. The challenge was immense. How do you hide 20 acres of factory land? The answer Detley and his team developed was simultaneously elegant and utterly insane. They would build an entire fake neighborhood on top of the factory. First, they stretched a massive network of steel cables across the entire facility, creating a support structure suspended about 20 feet above the factory's actual roofs. Over these cables, they stretched wire mesh covered with fabric treated to resemble grass or dirt from above. But that was just the beginning. Because an empty field is still suspicious. What you need is something that looks normal every day and completely uninteresting to a bomber searching for targets. So they began building houses. Not real houses, of course. They were lightweight wooden structures, painted and textured to look like real houses from above. They built fake streets, painted on the fabric covering the factory. They built fake trees using fabric molded over wire frames, each with its own shade carefully painted to match the angle of the sun at different times of the day. They built fake cars in the garages, made of wood and canvas, with reflections painted on the windshields. The level of detail was absurd. They didn't just paint grass, but grass that looked freshly cut in some yards and slightly overgrown in others. They painted garden paths that looked worn from use. They created drainage ditches that followed the natural topography. They even hung fake clothes on clotheslines, made of fabric that moved with the wind, and it worked. When Army pilots flew over the area to test the camouflage, many of them couldn't locate the factory, even though they knew exactly where it was. From bombing altitude, those 20 acres of industrial site had simply disappeared, replaced by a quiet suburban neighborhood. But there were enormous practical problems that needed to be solved. The factory still needed to function. Materials needed to be brought in. Assembled planes needed to be moved out. Workers needed access to the facility. So they created sections of the camouflage that could be retracted like curtains, allowing planes to be flown in and out. They created entrances that looked like garages or barns from the outside, but open to allow trucks to pass through. Airflow was also a huge problem, because factories produced a lot of heat, and this heat needed to escape so that workers wouldn't pass out. So they created ventilation systems that were disguised as residential chimneys or natural vents. Lockheed in Burbank faced even more complex challenges. The factory was located in a valley, surrounded by hills that would make camouflage more difficult because pilots could see it from multiple angles. The solution was even more ambitious. They decided to transform the entire area into a continuation of the surrounding rural landscape. Above the Lockheed plant, they created fake crop fields. Not just uniform green fields, but fields that appeared to have different crops at different stages of growth. They studied real farms in the area and replicated their patterns. They created dividing fences, dirt roads that cut through the fields, and even small agricultural structures like barns and silos. One of the most incredible stories about Lockheed Camouflage involves training planes that accidentally tried to land in what they thought was an open field. The pilots, disoriented or experiencing mechanical problems, saw what appeared to be a perfect field for an emergency landing. Only when they were very close did they realize it was an illusion, a screen stretched over a factory. Fortunately, they managed to gain altitude in time, but the incident served to demonstrate just how convincing the camouflage truly was. Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica was camouflaged to look like an extension of the coastal landscape. They created what appeared to be sand dunes, coastal undergrowth, and even small rock formations, all fake, all suspended over the real factory by that elaborate network of cables and structures. But camouflage wasn't just about visuals. The Germans were developing increasingly sophisticated detection technologies, and there were concerns about radar and other forms of reconnaissance. So camouflage teams also needed to consider how to reduce thermal signatures, how to disperse heat so it didn't create an obvious hotspot that could be detected. They needed to consider light patterns at night, ensuring that no industrial light escaped and revealed the location of factories. Blackouts were strictly enforced across the West Coast. But factories needed to operate around the clock to maintain production. So they created elaborate systems of blackout curtains and airlocks, transition areas where workers could enter and exit without allowing light to escape. It was like operating a gigantic photographic darkroom, but on an industrial scale. The people who worked in these camouflaged factories had a surreal experience. Imagine working in a massive industrial facility, but looking up and seeing not a factory roof, but a fake open sky, or the backdrop of fake houses. Sunlight filtered through the screens and fabrics, creating a diffuse and sometimes eerie illumination. On rainy days, water dripped through the camouflage, creating random patterns on the factory floor. In the summer, the heat beneath those layers of camouflage could be stifling, even with all the ventilation systems. There was also a psychological element to all this. The workers knew they were being protected by this elaborate illusion, but they also knew that if the illusion failed, if a Japanese bomber discovered their true location, they would be trapped beneath layers of fabric and wood that offered no protection against real bombs. It was both comforting and terrifying, and the camouflage teams couldn't simply create their illusions and leave. Camouflage required constant maintenance. Weather wore down the materials, winds tore the fabric, rain faded the paint. So there were permanent teams, often composed of some of the original artists, who worked continuously to repair and update the camouflage. They also needed to adapt the camouflage to seasonal changes. Fields that were green in spring needed to turn golden in summer, then brown in fall. Trees that had leaves needed to shed them in winter. Residential gardens needed to reflect what real gardens would look like at different times of the year. It was a Sisyphean task, but necessary to maintain the convincing illusion. One of the most interesting innovations was the use of artificial lighting to simulate normal nighttime activity. Since residential neighborhoods would have some lights on at night, even during partial blackouts, they created dim lighting systems that flickered randomly, simulating people moving around their homes, porch lights and televisions. This helped maintain the illusion that it was just another normal neighborhood, not a dark and silent industrial facility. There were moments of real tension. In February 1942, shortly after Pearl Harbor, what became known as the Battle of Los Angeles took place. Radar detected what they thought were enemy aircraft approaching the coast. Sirens blared throughout the city. Searchlights swept the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries fired over 1,400 shells into the night sky. People watched in terror as explosions lit up the clouds, but they never encountered enemy planes. To this day, it's unclear what exactly happened, whether it was weather balloons, mass panic, or a technical malfunction. But that night showed how real the fear of attack was. And this fear kept everyone working in these camouflages, knowing that what they were doing had a real purpose. It wasn't just theater, it wasn't just art. It was real defense against a real threat. Japanese submarines were indeed active along the West Coast. In February 1942, a Japanese submarine surfaced near Santa Barbara, and shelled an oil installation with its deck gun. The damage was minimal, but the attack demonstrated that the American coast was indeed within enemy reach. There were also Japanese bomb balloons called Fugo. Japan launched thousands of these balloons, each carrying incendiary bombs, relying on jet streams to carry them across the Pacific to North America. Hundreds arrived, crashing in locations from Alaska to Mexico. Most caused little or no damage, but they posed a real and unpredictable threat. In this context, camouflage wasn't paranoia. It was a sensible precaution against documented and real threats. But beyond physical protection, there was another important benefit to this elaborate camouflage. It was a tremendous morale boost. Factory workers who worked long, grueling shifts, performing repetitive and often dangerous work, knew someone was trying to protect them. The government hadn't simply crossed its fingers and hoped for the best. It had invested enormous resources, bringing in the country's most creative minds, to build an invisible shield over their heads. And for the general public, while many details were secret, the mere fact that these measures existed was reassuring. There were newspaper stories, obviously censored and vague, about how American ingenuity was being used to protect war production. It was part of the larger narrative that America was mobilizing, adapting, using every available resource to win. On the Japanese side, there is evidence that camouflage was effective. Documents captured after the war showed that the Japanese had intelligence on the general location of major production facilities on the West Coast, but their maps often had significant inaccuracies. More importantly, there was never a large-scale air attack against these facilities. Was this due to camouflage? Was it due to the sheer distance and logistical difficulty of mounting such an attack? Was it due to the effectiveness of American air defenses? It was likely a combination of all these factors, but what is undeniable is that the camouflaged factories continued operating without interruption throughout the war. The Boeing plant in Seattle produced more than 6,800 B-17 bombers. Lockheed in Burbank produced nearly 10,000 aircraft of various types. Douglas Aircraft produced nearly 30,000 planes. These numbers represent an absolutely massive contribution to the Allied victory. Every bomber that left these factories meant another mission over Europe or the Pacific. Every fighter meant more protection for ground troops or ships. Every transport meant more supplies getting where they were needed. American industrial production was, in many ways, the decisive factor in World War II, far surpassing what Germany, Japan, or Italy could produce, and protecting this production was absolutely critical. If the Japanese had managed to destroy or significantly damage even one of these large facilities, it would have delayed production by months, perhaps years. It would have given the Axis precious time to consolidate its gains and strengthen its defenses. It could have changed the course of specific battles where Allied air superiority was decisive, but beyond all the military strategy and industrial production, there was something deeply human about this project. There were artists using their skills to save lives. There were set designers who normally created illusions for entertainment, now creating illusions for survival. There was a recognition that creativity is not just a luxury in peacetime, but can be a vital tool in wartime. John Stuart Detley and others like him could have stayed safe in Hollywood, continuing to make films, which were considered important for morale, but they chose to use their skills in more direct ways, and they did so with a dedication and perfectionism that bordered on obsession. Because they knew that every detail mattered. A shadow at the wrong angle could draw attention. A texture that didn't match the surroundings could highlight rather than conceal. A fake tree moving unnaturally in the wind could reveal something was amiss. There were stories of artists climbing onto factory roofs, risking their lives to touch up fading paint. Of carpenters working in heavy rain to repair damaged structures before the camouflage lost its effectiveness. Of engineers staying up all night, calculating wind loads and stress points to ensure the entire suspended structure wouldn't collapse onto the factory it was protecting. And when the war ended, when Japan surrendered in August 1945, these elaborate camouflages were no longer necessary. Within weeks, they began to be dismantled. The steel cables were cut, the fake structures were torn down, the fabric was removed. The factories were once again exposed to the open sky. It must have been a bittersweet moment for the people who built and maintained these illusions. On the one hand, the fact that they were no longer needed meant the war was over. The threat had passed. But on the other, they were witnessing the destruction of something they had put so much work, so much care, so much creativity into. They were watching something disappear that, though built to be invisible, was monumentally impressive. Very little of the camouflage was preserved. A few scraps of painted fabric, a few photographs, some technical drawings. Most of it was simply discarded or recycled. It was obsolete war material, worthless in the post-war world. The stories were largely forgotten, archived in military documents that would take decades to declassify. But what these camouflages represented shouldn't be forgotten. They represented a willingness to think outside the box, to seek solutions in unexpected places. They represented the idea that there's no single way to solve a problem, that sometimes the answer isn't more armor or more weapons, but imagination and illusion. Today, when we fly over industrial cities, we see scattered factories and warehouses clearly visible. So it's easy to forget that there was a time when hiding these facilities was a matter of life or death, when open skies were a vulnerability, not just a view. Modern technology would render these theatrical camouflages obsolete. Satellites can see through visual illusions. Radar can penetrate fabric and detect real structures underneath. Infrared sensors can identify heat signatures that reveal industrial activity. Warfare has changed, and the ways of protecting strategic targets have changed with it. But there's still something to learn from these World War II set designers. They reminded us that reality is to some extent a matter of perspective, that what we see depends on where we are, how we look, and the assumptions we bring with us, that the impossible can seem normal if you construct the illusion carefully enough. And they reminded us that in times of crisis, every skill, every talent, every form of creativity can be called upon to serve. That artists and engineers, theaters and factories, imagination and industry all have roles to play in the survival and triumph of a nation. Those fake neighborhoods above Seattle, those illusory farmland above Burbank, those imaginary sand dunes above Santa Monica, they were more than just camouflage. They were testaments to the human capacity to adapt, to create, to transform limitations into possibilities. They were art in the service of life, creativity in the service of survival. And perhaps in the end, that's the most important lesson. That no matter how desperate the situation, how impossible the challenge, there's always room for imagination. There's always a way to look at a problem from a different angle and see a solution no one had considered before. The set designers who built these camouflages are mostly gone. The factories they protected have been renovated or demolished. The wars we fight now are different from those of then. But the spirit of what they did, the willingness to use every tool available, to think outside the box, to protect what is precious with creativity and dedication, that spirit remains relevant. And as long as we look up at the sky and see clouds where there are airplanes, or fields where there are factories, or normality where there is danger, we will be using the lessons these artists taught us, that the greatest defense sometimes isn't being stronger, but being smarter. It's not being more visible, but being invisible. It's not changing reality, but changing how reality is perceived. But there are even more layers to this story that deserve to be told. Because the camouflage of the factories was not an isolated project. It was part of a massive civil protection effort that completely transformed the American West Coast during the war years. While factories were hidden beneath fake neighborhoods and imaginary fields, other forms of camouflage were being implemented everywhere. Strategic bridges were painted with disruptive patterns that broke their recognizable lines when viewed from above. Water reservoirs were covered with camouflage netting to block sunlight and create navigational landmarks for bombers. Even important roads were sometimes visually diverted, with patterns painted on the asphalt that made a straight highway appear curved or interrupted. In San Francisco, the entire Golden Gate Bridge was considered a potential target. Its distinctive orange color and iconic location made it a perfect navigational landmark. There were serious discussions about painting it entirely green and gray to blend in with the surrounding hills. Ultimately, they decided it would be too much work and that anti-aircraft defenses would suffice. But the fact that they considered it shows how far they were willing to go. Ports also received special attention. Anchored ships were tempting targets, clustered together and vulnerable, so they developed camouflage net systems that could be quickly strung over groups of ships, making them appear from above as harbor structures or even as water. Some of these nets were so large that they required special cranes to manipulate them. And it wasn't just military and industrial installations. Entire cities regularly participated in blackout drills. Sirens blared, and within minutes all outdoor lighting had to be turned off. Cars stopped and turned off their headlights. People covered windows with special blackout curtains. Blackout inspectors patrolled the streets, knocking on doors where any crack of light was visible. Discipline was strict because everyone understood that a single light could serve as a landmark for bombers. There were stories of people being fined or even arrested for blackout violations. A shop owner who left a window light on. A driver who didn't turn off their headlights quickly enough. It might sound harsh, but the fear was real. People in coastal cities lived with the constant awareness that the ocean, which had always been a source of prosperity and beauty, was now also an avenue of danger. The beaches were transformed. Those same California beaches where families had picnicked and children had built sandcastles were now surrounded by barbed wire. Concrete bunkers were built at strategic points, with guns pointing out to sea. Trenches were dug. Mines were placed in some areas. The beaches became military zones, off limits to civilians for much of the war, and there was the human factor in all of this. Thousands of Japanese Americans lived on the West Coast, many of them third or fourth generation citizens. After Pearl Harbor, paranoia and prejudice led to one of the most shameful decisions in American history. Executive Order 966, signed in February 1942, authorized the forced removal of over 120,000 people of Japanese descent to internment camps in the interior. These people lost their homes, their businesses, their communities. They were treated as enemies in their own land, without any evidence of disloyalty. And ironically, while this was happening, many young Japanese Americans volunteered to serve in the military, forming units like the 442 Infantry Regiment, which became one of the most decorated units of the entire war. This contradiction, this ability to treat people with terrible injustice while accepting their sacrifice in combat, is one of the lasting stains of that period. And it's worth remembering because it shows us that even in moments of great national heroism, even when we're doing extraordinary things like camouflaging entire factories, we're also capable of great injustices. But returning to camouflage, there were fascinating technical aspects that we haven't yet fully explored. The question of perspective, for example, was incredibly complex. A fake house that looks perfect from 4,000 meters might look strange from 2,000 or 6,000 meters. So designers had to create illusions that worked across a range of altitudes. They did this using principles of forced perspective, techniques borrowed directly from theater and film. A house that was actually only 10 feet tall could appear 20 feet tall when viewed from the right angle, with carefully calculated proportions of windows, doors, and roofs. Trees were constructed at different scales to create the illusion of depth and distance. Lighting was also crucial. The sun changes position throughout the day, creating different shadows, so each camouflage element had to be positioned, considering how it would appear at different times of the day. Some shadows were painted permanently, because they would always be there. Others were created by the three-dimensional structure of the fake elements themselves. And then there was the issue of vegetation. Early projects attempted to use real plants in some areas, growing in boxes of soil placed over the camouflage, but they found it impractical. The plants required a lot of water, and water was heavy. The plants grew unpredictably, so they reverted to completely artificial plants, made of fabric and wire, which could be precisely controlled. One of the most clever innovations was the use of different fabric textures. Smooth fabric reflected light one way, rough fabric another. By combining different textures, they could create areas that appeared shaded or sunny, damp or dry, freshly worked or abandoned. It was like painting with light and shadow in 3 dimensions. The tests for these camouflages were elaborate. Pilots flew over the camouflaged installations repeatedly at different altitudes, different approach angles, and different light conditions. They took photographs that were then meticulously analyzed. Any imperfections were flagged, and teams were sent in to correct them. And there was a cat-and-mouse game going on. Camouflage designers knew the Japanese were improving their aerial reconnaissance techniques, so they were constantly updating and refining their camouflage. trying to stay ahead of any new detection capabilities the enemy might develop. There were even experiments with dynamic camouflage, elements that could be quickly changed to adapt to different conditions. For example, sections of false field could be changed from green to brown in a matter of hours to match real seasonal changes in the surrounding area, or elements that could be removed or added to create different shadow patterns. Another interesting aspect was the integration with the real communities surrounding the factories. The fake neighborhoods built on top of the factories had to look consistent with the adjacent real neighborhoods. If the real houses were of a certain architectural style, the fake houses had to follow suit. If the real streets ran in a certain pattern, the fake streets had to continue that pattern. In some cases, this meant that camouflage elements extended beyond the factory's boundaries. Fake structures were built on adjacent land to create a seamless transition between illusion and reality. It was as if the factory itself were gradually fading away at the edges, dissolving into the surrounding environment. And there were sound considerations too. Factories are noisy. Pneumatic hammers, welding machines, test engines. All of this creates an industrial cacophony that couldn't be completely hidden, but it could be masked to some extent. Some of the fake buildings constructed over the factories had basic soundproofing, not enough to eliminate the sound, but enough to muffle and diffuse it, making it harder to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. The teams working on these camouflages developed a culture all their own. They were a strange mix of artists, engineers, military personnel, and construction workers. They shared a sense of mission and a pride in their unorthodox work. Many wore military uniforms but worked as civilians. Some were famous artists in their former lives, others were completely unknown. But all were united by the unique challenge they faced. There was friendly competition between the different camouflage teams. The Boeing team in Seattle wanted their camouflage to outperform Lockheed's in Burbank. Pilots were challenged to try to find the camouflaged factories, and when they failed, the camouflage teams celebrated as if they had won a battle, and in a sense they did. Every time a test pilot failed to locate the factory he was looking for, it was a small victory. It was proof that the illusion worked, that the effort was worth it. It was hope that if an enemy bomber did come, he could fly right past without recognizing the target below. But the work also took its toll. Working on structures suspended dozens of meters above the ground was dangerous. Accidents occurred. People fell. Some were injured, some died. There was also the constant tension of working under the threat of attack. Every false alarm, every air defense drill reminded everyone that the danger was real, and there were personal sacrifices. Many of the camouflage artists and technicians had left promising careers. They could have been earning more money, working in safer conditions, doing work that would have brought them public recognition. But they chose to be there, doing work that could never be fully explained or exhibited, at least not until the war was over. Their families often didn't know exactly what they were doing. Security was tight. They could say they were working in defense, but they couldn't explain the details. Imagine trying to explain to your child why you spend your days building fake houses on top of a factory without being able to actually tell them what you're doing. Imagine the wife or husband at home worried, knowing their spouse is doing something important but dangerous, but not knowing exactly what. After the war, when the camouflage designs were finally made public, there was a brief moment of recognition. Magazines published articles with photographs of the camouflages. People marveled at the scope and ingenuity of the designs. But the moment quickly passed. The country was busy looking forward, not back. There was an atomic age to navigate, a Cold War beginning, a whole new world to build, and the set designers returned to their regular careers. Some returned to Hollywood and had long and successful careers. Others returned to the theater. Some went into industrial design or architecture, but all carried with them the memory of those extraordinary years when their talent was used in ways they never imagined. John Stuart Detley, who led Boeing's camouflage efforts, returned to set design after the war. He worked on numerous successful productions. But in later interviews, when asked about the work he was most proud of, he always mentioned camouflage. Not out of artistic vanity, but because he knew he had made a real difference. He knew his work had helped protect lives and contributed to victory, and there was a growing recognition, even after the war, that the kind of interdisciplinary thinking required for camouflage projects was valuable beyond the military context. The ability to bring together experts from completely different fields, artists and engineers, military and civilian, and get them to collaborate on a complex problem became a model for other projects. In fact, it could be argued that camouflage projects were precursors to the kind of interdisciplinary teams that have become common in fields such as industrial design, large-scale architecture, and even technology development. The idea that innovative solutions often come from combining knowledge from different disciplines was dramatically demonstrated by the camouflages of World War II. There were also lessons in large-scale project management, coordinating the work of hundreds of people, managing tight schedules, and dealing with resource constraints, all while maintaining rigorous quality and safety standards. These were skills that proved valuable in many post-war contexts. And then there was the issue of innovation under pressure. Camouflage designers didn't have the luxury of time. They couldn't spend years developing and testing their ideas. They had to create solutions that worked and worked quickly. This ability to innovate quickly, to iterate on designs, to learn from failures and adjust, these became valued traits in many industries. But perhaps the most profound lesson of camouflage was about the nature of perception and reality. Because what the set designers did, ultimately, was demonstrate that much of what we consider real is actually constructed. Our perception is shaped by expectations, context, and assumptions. When we see something that fits our mental model of how the world should look, we don't question it. We accept it. The camouflaged factories worked because pilots expected to see residential neighborhoods or agricultural fields when they looked down. So when they saw exactly that, they stopped looking. Their minds filled in the missing details. Small imperfections in the illusion were ignored because the overall pattern made sense. This understanding of human perception has applications far beyond war. It concerns how we create experiences, how we design spaces, how we communicate ideas. It concerns understanding that what people perceive is not necessarily what is actually there, but rather a construct of their minds, based on sensory information and prior expectations. And this leads us to deeper philosophical questions. If a factory can be made to disappear simply by changing how people perceive it, what else in our lives is perceptually constructed rather than inherently real? How many of our certainties are based on carefully constructed illusions? How often do we accept surfaces without questioning what lies beneath? These are not just abstract questions. They have practical relevance to how we navigate the modern world, where images can be digitally manipulated, where misinformation can be spread instantly, where the line between reality and fabrication is increasingly blurred. The lessons of World War II stage designers about the malleability of perception are perhaps more relevant now than ever. But we shouldn't end on a cynical note, because there was also something deeply human and even hopeful in these camouflage projects. There was a recognition that creativity matters, that imagination has real value, that art isn't just decoration, but can be a tool for survival. In a world often divided between practical and creative, between useful and beautiful, between science and art, camouflage projects have shown these divisions to be false. They have shown that the greatest human achievements often occur when we cross these artificial boundaries, when we combine logic and imagination, when we use all our capabilities together. And there was something remarkably democratic about it all. It wasn't generals or politicians who solved the problem of how to protect the factories. It was artists, people who normally remain on the fringes of power, people whose work is often considered non-essential. But when the crisis hit, it was their specific skills that proved crucial. It reminds us that we never know where the next crucial solution will come from. It reminds us to value the diversity of talents and knowledge. It reminds us that people doing work that seems impractical or decorative can, in the right circumstances, save nations. The camouflaged factories of World War II were dismantled over 80 years ago. The fabrics rotted, the structures were scrapped, the cables were cut. Almost nothing remains physically. But what they represented, what they taught, remains. They remain in the design principles we still use today. They remain in the military camouflage techniques that evolved from those early experiments. They remain in the cultural memory of a time when the entire nation mobilized, when every talent was called to serve, when the distinction between warfront and homefront disappeared, because everyone was part of the effort. And they remain a reminder that in our darkest moments, when the future seems uncertain and threats seem overwhelming, humanity has resources we are not always aware of. We have the ability to adapt, to innovate, to find solutions in unlikely places. We have the ability to transform limitations into opportunities, vulnerabilities into strengths. The generations who lived through those years, who built those impossible camouflages, who worked under those false skies are largely gone. But their stories deserve to be remembered, not just as historical curiosities but as inspiration. Because the challenges we face now, though different in nature, demand the same kind of creativity, the same willingness to think differently, the same commitment to protecting what is valuable. We thank the Lord God for blessing those creative minds with the ability to imagine the impossible and make it a reality. We thank Him for giving them the courage to use their talents in times of great danger, when it would have been easier and safer to stand aside. We thank Him for inspiring in them the perseverance to keep those illusions going, day after day, month after month, year after year, even when they didn't know if an enemy would ever see them. We thank the Lord God for protecting those workers under those false roofs, who continued producing the instruments of victory, even though they knew their protection was merely an illusion of fabric and paint. We thank You for guiding the hands of the Allied pilots who flew over those camouflaged factories and failed to recognize them, because that meant the camouflage worked. We thank You for keeping the skies clear of enemy bombers, whether by camouflage, distance, defenses, or simply by Your grace. We thank the Lord God for reminding us through this story that He works through all our abilities, not just the obvious or conventional ones, that a scenic painter can serve as truly as a soldier, that an artist can protect lives as effectively as a general. We thank Him for showing us that every gift we are given has a purpose, even when that purpose is not immediately apparent. And we thank the Lord God for continuing to bless us with creativity, with ingenuity, with the ability to see beyond the obvious and imagine solutions that others would consider impossible. May we, like those set designers of times past, use our gifts not only for our own benefit, but to protect and serve those around us. May we face our challenges with the same creative determination, the same willingness to try what has never been tried, the same faith that with His help, nothing is truly impossible. Amen.